I never thought I'd be standing in the middle of someone else's wedding disaster, but life has a way of throwing you into situations you never asked for. My name is Rebecca, and this is the story of how one cruel comment at a stranger's wedding changed everything for me and connected me to a past I thought I'd left behind forever. Let me start from the beginning, because you need to understand where I was in my life to really grasp why what happened mattered so much. 3 years ago, I weighed 347 pounds. I know because I stepped on the scale at my doctor's office, and she looked at me with those sympathetic eyes that somehow made everything worse. She didn't say much that day, just handed me pamphlets about bariatric surgery and diabetes prevention. I took them home and cried for 2 hours straight in my tiny apartment bathroom, sitting on the edge of the tub because I couldn't even fit comfortably in the space anymore. I was 31 years old, working as a data analyst for a mid-sized insurance company, and my life had become incredibly small. Not just physically, though, that was certainly true. I had stopped going out with friends because I couldn't handle the stares in restaurants or the way chairs creaked under me. I ordered everything online to avoid shopping in stores where nothing fit. My world had shrunk down to my apartment, my office cubicle, and the drive-thru at various fast food places that had become my only source of comfort. My younger sister, Amanda, was the only person who still tried to get me out of my shell. She'd call me every week, begging me to come to dinner parties or birthday celebrations, and I'd make up excuse after excuse. The truth was, I couldn't bear to see the way people looked at me, the judgment in their eyes, the whispered comments they thought I couldn't hear. But Amanda never gave up on me. She's 5 years younger than me, a fitness instructor with the kind of energy that could power a small city. We looked nothing alike even before I gained all the weight. She had our mother's petite frame and delicate features, while I'd always been bigger, even as a kid. Our relationship had been strained for years, not because of anything she did, but because I couldn't stand being around someone who seemed to have it all figured out when I felt like such a complete failure. One Saturday afternoon, she showed up at my door unannounced. I almost didn't answer, but she had a key and threatened to use it. When I opened the door, she pushed past me with grocery bags full of vegetables and lean proteins. She said, "Rebecca, I love you, but I'm scared I'm going to lose you. Not someday in the distant future, but soon. And I can't let that happen without fighting for you, even if you've stopped fighting for yourself." I wanted to be angry at her. I wanted to tell her to mind her own business and leave me alone with my pain. But instead, I just broke down. All the emotions I'd been stuffing down with food for years came pouring out. I told her everything. How worthless I felt, how I hated myself, how I didn't know how to stop the cycle of eating to feel better and then hating myself more for eating. She held me while I cried, and when I finally stopped, she said, "I'm not going to tell you to just eat less and exercise more, because I know it's not that simple. But I am going to be here for you, every single day if that's what it takes. We're going to figure this out together." And she meant it. Amanda moved in with me for 6 months. She threw out all the junk food in my apartment, which led to our first huge fight, but she stood her ground. She cooked healthy meals, walked with me every evening even when I could barely make it around the block, and held me accountable without making me feel judged. The first 3 months were absolute hell. I was irritable, exhausted, and convinced that nothing was going to change. But Amanda kept showing up, kept encouraging me, kept believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself. Slowly, things started to shift. I lost 10 pounds, then 20, then 30. My doctor was thrilled and adjusted my meal plan to keep the momentum going. Amanda introduced me to her gym, and while I was terrified at first, she made sure I had a private trainer who specialized in working with people who were significantly overweight. His name was Marcus, and he was one of the kindest people I'd ever met. He never pushed me beyond what I could handle, never made me feel bad about where I was starting from, and celebrated every small victory like it was a major achievement. When I could finally do a full minute on the elliptical without feeling like I was dying, he high-fived me with genuine excitement. The weight came off slowly, about 10 to 15 pounds a month, which my doctor said was the healthiest pace. It wasn't dramatic like those reality shows where people lose 100 pounds in a few months, but it was sustainable. More importantly, I was changing on the inside too. I started to feel stronger, more capable, more like a person who had value beyond my appearance. Amanda moved back to her own place after 6 months, but by then, I had the tools and habits I needed to keep going. I continued working with Marcus, seeing a therapist to address my emotional eating, and building a life that didn't revolve around food as comfort. My therapist, Dr. Patricia Chen, was instrumental in helping me understand the psychological aspects of my relationship with food. She had me keep a journal where I wrote down not just what I ate, but what I was feeling when I ate it. The patterns that emerged were painful to see. I ate when I was lonely, when I was stressed, when I was bored, when I was sad, when I was happy. Food had become my response to every emotion, my way of numbing myself to the pain of existing in a world that constantly told me I was unacceptable. We worked on developing other coping mechanisms. When I felt the urge to binge eat, I learned to pause and ask myself what I was really feeling. Sometimes I'd call Amanda or a friend instead of reaching for food. Sometimes I'd go for a walk or write in my journal or take a bath. It wasn't easy, and I slipped up plenty of times, but gradually, food lost its power over me. Dr. Chen also helped me work through the trauma of years of bullying and discrimination. I'd never thought of it as trauma before, but she explained that repeated experiences of being treated as less than human, of being mocked and excluded and judged, absolutely constituted trauma. We did EMDR therapy to process some of the worst memories, the ones that still made me cry years later. There was the time in high school when a group of boys mooed at me as I walked past them in the hallway. The time a guy I had a crush on laughed in my face when his friends dared him to ask me out. The time I went to a family reunion and my aunt pulled my mother aside to loudly whisper that someone needed to do something about my weight before it was too late. The time I tried to go to a yoga class and the instructor suggested I might be more comfortable in a class for beginners, even though it was a beginner class. The time a date walked out of the restaurant after seeing me in person because my profile pictures had apparently been misleading. Each memory was a wound that had never properly healed, and Dr. Chen helped me clean them out and bandage them properly. It was painful work, but it was necessary. I couldn't move forward while carrying all that unprocessed hurt. 2 years after that day, Amanda showed up at my door. I had lost 187 pounds. I was down to 160 pounds, which was a healthy weight for my 5'8" frame. I didn't look like a fitness model. I had loose skin and stretch marks that told the story of where I'd been, but I felt alive in a way I hadn't in over a decade. The loose skin was something I struggled with at first. After losing so much weight, I had excess skin on my arms, my stomach, my thighs. It hung there as a reminder of my former body, and part of me hated it. I researched skin removal surgery extensively, even had consultations with plastic surgeons, but ultimately decided against it. The recovery time was extensive, the cost was prohibitive, and most importantly, I realized that the loose skin was part of my story. It was evidence of how far I'd come, of the work I'd done, of the life I'd reclaimed. Amanda helped me reframe how I thought about my body. She said, "Rebecca, your body carried you through hell and back. It deserves your respect and gratitude, not your hatred. Every stretch mark is a badge of honor. Every loose fold of skin is proof that you survived and transformed. Your body isn't the enemy. It never was." I bought new clothes, started dating again, and even got a promotion at work. My boss, a woman named Jennifer who'd always been kind to me, pulled me aside one day to tell me how impressed she was with my dedication and discipline. She said it showed in my work too, that I'd become more confident, more willing to speak up in meetings, more assertive about my ideas. She promoted me to senior analyst with a significant pay raise. The dating was harder than I'd expected. I'd thought that once I lost weight, dating would suddenly become easy, but it turned out I still carried all my insecurities. On my first date after the weight loss, I was so nervous I could barely eat. The guy, a software engineer named Tom, was nice enough, but I kept waiting for him to realize I wasn't good enough, to make an excuse and leave. When he asked me out for a second date, I was genuinely shocked. Tom and I dated for about 4 months. He was kind and thoughtful, but ultimately, we wanted different things. He was looking for someone to settle down with immediately, ready to get married and start having kids within a year, and I wasn't there yet. I was still figuring out who I was in this new body, with this new life. We parted on good terms, and the breakup didn't devastate me the way I'd feared it would. It actually made me realize how much I'd grown. Old Rebecca would have clung to any relationship, would have compromised everything to avoid being alone. New Rebecca knew her worth and wasn't willing to settle. I was beginning to think that maybe I deserved good things, that maybe my worth wasn't tied to my weight after all. But losing weight doesn't erase the scars that being overweight leaves on your psyche. I still heard the cruel comments in my head, still remembered every person who'd made me feel less than human because of my size. And I still had this deep, aching sensitivity to how people treated others who were going through what I'd been through. I became hyper-aware of weight discrimination in everyday life. I noticed when restaurant booths were too small for larger people. I noticed when clothing stores didn't carry plus sizes or relegated them to a tiny corner in the back. I noticed when doctors dismissed symptoms and blamed everything on weight. I noticed when people made casual jokes about fat people, not realizing how much those words could hurt. And it made me angry in a way I'd never allowed myself to be angry before. Which brings me to the wedding where everything changed. It was a beautiful Saturday in late September, and I was actually looking forward to the event. My co-worker, James, had invited the whole team to his wedding at this gorgeous vineyard about an hour outside the city. I'd bought a dress that actually fit well, something I never would have done before, and I felt pretty good about myself. James was one of the few co-workers who'd been consistently kind to me even when I was at my heaviest. He'd never made comments about my weight, never joined in when others made jokes, and had always treated me with genuine respect. When he'd handed out invitations to the team, he'd made a point of telling me he really hoped I'd come, that it wouldn't be the same without me there. The ceremony was lovely, held outdoors with rows of white chairs facing an arbor covered in flowers. James married his college sweetheart, a woman named Patricia who taught elementary school. They were clearly deeply in love, and watching them exchange vows made me hopeful about finding that kind of connection someday. The reception was in a rustic barn that had been transformed into an elegant space with twinkling lights and elegant decorations. Everything seemed perfect. The food was delicious, a buffet with options for every dietary preference. The wine flowed freely. People were dancing and laughing, celebrating the happy couple. I was standing near the dessert table, talking with a few colleagues about a project we were working on, when I heard a commotion near the dance floor. A woman's voice, sharp and angry, cut through the music and conversation. "Your fat mother-in-law is ruining my pictures. Can someone please get her out of the background? This is supposed to be my special day, and she's making everything look terrible." The entire reception seemed to freeze. The music was still playing, but conversations stopped mid-sentence as everyone turned to look at the source of the outburst. The bride, a woman in her mid-20s with an elaborate white dress and professionally done hair and makeup, was standing near the photographer, pointing toward an older woman who had been dancing with what looked like her husband. The older woman, who I estimated to be in her late 50s or early 60s, was overweight, probably around 250 pounds. She was wearing a lovely navy blue dress and had been smiling and laughing just moments before. Now, her face had gone completely pale. Her husband put his arm around her protectively, his own expression shifting from confusion to anger. I could see her hands trembling as she clutched her purse, and the look in her eyes was one I recognized intimately. It was the look of someone who'd just been publicly humiliated, someone whose worst fears about how others saw them had just been confirmed in the most brutal way possible. The bride continued, apparently oblivious to the horrified reactions around her. "I specifically told the photographer I wanted candid shots of people having fun, but not if they're going to look like that. Can we please be more selective about who's in the frame? I didn't pay thousands of dollars for photos that are going to be ruined by people who couldn't be bothered to look presentable for my wedding." I felt my heart racing. All the memories of being that person, the one people didn't want in photos, the one who was told she was ruining events just by existing, came flooding back. I remembered my cousin's wedding where the photographer had literally asked me to step out of group photos because I was, quote, blocking too much of the background. I remembered birthday parties where I'd strategically positioned myself behind others so I'd be less visible in pictures. I remembered the shame, the humiliation, the sense that my very existence was an imposition on others. Without thinking, I started walking toward the bride. My hands were shaking and my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Part of me was screaming to stay out of it, to not make a scene, to protect myself from potential confrontation. But a louder part of me, the part that had been silent for too many years, was saying that if I didn't speak up now, I'd regret it forever. My colleague Sarah grabbed my arm. "Rebecca, don't get involved. This isn't your problem. You're going to make things awkward for all of us." But I shook her off gently. It absolutely was my problem. If not me, then who was going to say something? Everyone else was standing there in shocked silence, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to confront the bride. Someone needed to speak up, and I had the unique perspective of knowing exactly what that mother-in-law was feeling in that moment. I walked right up to the bride, my hands trembling, but my voice steady. "Excuse me, but did you really just say that about your mother-in-law?" The bride turned to me with an irritated expression, looking me up and down with barely concealed disdain. "And who are you?" "I don't remember inviting you to my wedding." "I'm a guest of James and Patricia," I said, keeping my voice level despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "But that's not relevant. What's relevant is that you just publicly humiliated someone who deserves your respect. That woman is your husband's mother. She gave birth to him, raised him, loved him, and by all appearances, helped make this wedding possible. And you just called her fat in front of everyone here and told the photographer to exclude her from your pictures. The bride's face flushed red, but her voice was defensive and sharp. This is my wedding. I have every right to want it to be perfect. I've been planning this day for over a year, and I've worked so hard on every detail. If people can't be bothered to look presentable, then maybe they shouldn't be in the photos. Is that really so unreasonable? I'm not asking for much. I just want my wedding album to be something I can look at without cringing. The entitlement in her voice made my anger burn hotter. Look presentable? I repeated. She's wearing a beautiful dress. Her hair and makeup are done. She was out there dancing and celebrating with your husband. What exactly is unpresentable about her except for the fact that she's overweight? The bride rolled her eyes. Oh, please. Don't act like you don't understand what I'm talking about. Nobody wants to look at wedding photos full of overweight people. It's just not aesthetically pleasing. I've seen too many wedding albums ruined by unflattering people in the background. I'm simply trying to avoid that. I took a deep breath, trying to control the rage that was threatening to overwhelm me. Do you have any idea how cruel you sound right now? That woman is a human being, not a piece of furniture that ruins your aesthetic. She has feelings, she has dignity, and she deserves to be treated with respect regardless of what she weighs. Before the bride could respond, a man's voice behind me said, Melissa, what the hell is going on here? I turned to see the groom approaching, his face a mixture of confusion and growing anger. He was a tall man in his late 20s, handsome in his tuxedo, and there was something vaguely familiar about him that I couldn't quite place. But as his eyes landed on me, something changed. His expression shifted from anger to shock to something I couldn't quite identify. Rebecca, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca Morrison? I stared at him, my mind racing to place him. He looked vaguely familiar, something about the eyes and the shape of his jaw, but I couldn't quite place him. The context of being at a wedding, of confronting his bride, made it even harder to think clearly. Do I know you? He took a step closer, ignoring his bride completely. His eyes were wide, and there was something like wonder in his expression. It's me, David Chen. We went to high school together. You probably don't remember me, I was pretty quiet back then, but we had chemistry class together junior year, and you helped me pass when I was really struggling. And then it clicked. David Chen. He'd been a skinny, shy kid with glasses who sat in the back of the classroom and barely spoke. I'd been assigned as his lab partner, and we'd actually become friendly over the course of that year. He'd struggled with the material, but he was so earnest and willing to learn that I'd spent hours helping him study. We'd had these great conversations during lab work about everything from science fiction novels to our dreams for the future. He'd been one of the few people who'd been kind to me even when I was already struggling with my weight. David, I said, recognition flooding through me. Of course I remember you. You're the groom? He nodded, but his expression was troubled as he looked from me to his bride, who was watching our exchange with growing confusion and annoyance. What are you doing here? I work with James from your accounting department, I explained. He invited the whole team. I had no idea this was your wedding until just now. David's jaw tightened as he processed this information. He turned to his bride, and I could see the anger building in his expression. Melissa, did you really just say what I think you said about my mother? The bride, Melissa, seemed to finally realize that something had gone very wrong. Her face cycled through several expressions: confusion, irritation, realization, panic. Baby, I was just trying to make sure the photos turned out nice. You know how important this day is to me. I've been dreaming about my wedding since I was a little girl, and I just want everything to be perfect. You understand that, right? I didn't mean to hurt anyone's feelings. I was just being practical. David's voice was cold in a way that made everyone nearby take notice. Practical? You called my mother fat in front of all our guests and told the photographer not to include her in photos because she's ruining your aesthetic. That's not practical, Melissa. That's cruel. Melissa's face went from red to pale. I didn't use those exact words. She's exaggerating. She pointed at me accusingly. I just mentioned that maybe your mother could stand somewhere else for some of the photos. This woman is twisting my words to make me sound like a monster. I felt my own anger flare up again. I'm not twisting anything. You said, and I quote, "Your fat mother-in-law is ruining my pictures." Those were your exact words. Everyone here heard you. Several guests nearby nodded in confirmation. An older gentleman, who I later learned was David's uncle, spoke up. She's right, David. We all heard exactly what Melissa said. There's no ambiguity here. By this point, David's mother had made her way over, along with his father. The mother's eyes were red, and I could tell she'd been crying. Her husband had his arm around her protectively, and the look he was giving Melissa was absolutely withering. David immediately moved to his mother's side and put his arm around her shoulders. "Mom, I'm so sorry," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't deserve this. Nobody deserves this. I can't believe Melissa would say something so hurtful, especially on what's supposed to be a day of love and celebration." His mother tried to smile, but her voice was shaky and small. "It's okay, sweetheart. Maybe I should just go. I don't want to cause problems on your wedding day. This is supposed to be the happiest day of your life, and I don't want to ruin it." The fact that she was blaming herself, that she thought she was the problem, made my heart ache. I'd been in that position so many times, apologizing for my existence, trying to make myself smaller and less noticeable so I wouldn't inconvenience others. "No," David said firmly, his voice growing stronger. "You're not going anywhere, Mom. This is your son's wedding, and you have every right to be here and to be in every photo you want to be in. You've done nothing wrong. Absolutely nothing." He turned back to Melissa, and the entire reception was now watching the drama unfold. The DJ had cut the music, and you could have heard a pin drop in the barn. "I never realized how shallow you were," he said, each word measured and deliberate. "All the months we were planning this wedding, all the times my mother tried to get to know you better, and you barely gave her the time of day. I told myself you were just stressed about the wedding. I made excuses for you. I told myself that once the wedding was over, once the stress of planning was behind us, you'd relax and show the kind and loving person I thought you were. But this shows me exactly who you are, and I don't like what I see." Melissa's eyes went wide with panic. "David, you're overreacting. Everyone's watching. Please, can we please just talk about this later? In private? We can work this out. I'll apologize to your mother. I'll make it right. Just please don't do this here, in front of everyone." "No," he said. "We're going to talk about it right now, because what you did was public, and my response needs to be public too. Do you have any idea what it's like to be judged solely on your appearance? To be made to feel less than human because of your body? To be told that you're ruining someone's special day just by existing in your own skin?" He gestured to me, and I felt all eyes turn toward me. Rebecca here knows. When we were in high school, she was one of the kindest, smartest people I knew. She helped me pass chemistry when I was struggling. She spent her lunch periods tutoring me instead of eating with her friends. She was patient and encouraging, and never made me feel stupid for not understanding the material. But kids were cruel to her because she was overweight. I watched her eat lunch alone in the library because she couldn't stand the cafeteria. I saw the way people treated her, the comments they made, the way they acted like she was invisible or worse, like she was something disgusting they had to avoid. And it made me sick then, just like this makes me sick now. I felt tears welling up in my eyes. I hadn't realized David had noticed any of that back then. We'd been friendly in class, but I'd assumed that, like everyone else, he hadn't really paid attention to my struggles outside of our lab work. The fact that he'd seen me, that he'd noticed my pain, meant more than I could express. Melissa was looking around desperately, as if hoping someone would come to her defense, but the guests were either looking away uncomfortably or nodding in agreement with David. Even her own bridesmaids looked horrified by what she'd said. One of them, a tall blonde woman in a lavender dress, actually mouthed the words, "I'm sorry," to David's mother. David's father spoke up then, his voice gruff but thick with emotion. "Son, your mother and I have loved and supported you in every decision you've made. We had our reservations about Melissa from the start, but we kept them to ourselves because you seemed happy. We told ourselves that maybe we were being too judgmental, that we needed to give her more time. But if this young woman thinks it's acceptable to humiliate your mother at your own wedding, to reduce her to nothing more than an aesthetic problem that needs to be solved, then maybe you need to think long and hard about what kind of life you're signing up for, what kind of person you're binding yourself to legally and emotionally, what kind of mother she might be to your children someday if this is how she treats people who don't meet her standards." David nodded slowly, and I could see him working through something in his mind. His hands were clenched at his sides, and his jaw was tight with tension. The silence in the barn was deafening, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. Then he did something that shocked everyone, including me. He reached up and slowly, deliberately removed his boutonniere, the small flower arrangement on his lapel that matched Melissa's bouquet. "Melissa," he said quietly, but his voice carried in the silent barn, "I can't marry someone who would treat my mother this way. I can't build a life with someone who thinks it's okay to humiliate people because of how they look. I can't make vows to love and cherish someone who clearly doesn't understand what those words actually mean. I'm sorry. But I can't do this. I won't do this. The collective gasp from the guests was audible, a sound like wind rushing through the barn. Melissa's face went through several shades of red and white, her mouth opening and closing without sound for several seconds. "You're calling off our wedding?" she finally managed to say, her voice rising to a near shriek. "Over this? Over some fat woman's hurt feelings? Are you insane? Do you have any idea how much money we've spent? How many people are here? What people will say?" "That's my mother you're talking about," David said, his voice hard as steel. "And you just proved exactly why I'm making the right decision. The fact that you still don't see what you did wrong, that you're more concerned about money and appearances than about the pain you've caused, tells me everything I need to know. I think you should leave." "I'm not leaving." Melissa's voice was shrill now, panic and anger mixing together. "This is my wedding. I've been planning this for over a year. You can't just call it off because I made one tiny comment that people are blowing way out of proportion." "This isn't a tiny comment, Melissa. This is a revelation of character. And it's not just this moment. Now that I'm really thinking about it, I can see the pattern. The way you talked about the catering staff being unprofessional because one of them was overweight. The way you insisted we couldn't invite your cousin because she wouldn't photograph well. The way you've made comments about random strangers' appearances throughout our entire relationship. I ignored it because I wanted to believe you were better than that. But you're not, and I can't pretend anymore." David pulled off his wedding ring, the one they'd exchanged earlier during the ceremony, and held it out to her. "I'll deal with all the legal and financial stuff later. I'll make sure you're not financially burdened by this decision. But right now, I need you to leave before you cause any more damage. Before you say anything else that can't be taken back." Melissa looked at the ring in his outstretched hand as if it were a snake. She looked around wildly, perhaps hoping someone would support her, but the guests were stone-faced or actively nodding in agreement with David. Her mother, who I recognized from the ceremony, was standing near the entrance with her hands over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Even she seemed to understand that her daughter had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Finally, Melissa let out a frustrated, anguished scream and stormed toward the exit, her elaborate dress trailing behind her like a deflating parachute. She ripped off her veil and threw it on the ground as she went. Her bridesmaids and a few family members awkwardly followed, whispering among themselves. One of the bridesmaids picked up the discarded veil and folded it carefully, a small gesture of dignity in the chaos. The barn remained in stunned silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only a minute or two. David stood there, still holding the ring, looking shell-shocked by what he'd just done. His parents moved to his side, his mother taking his hand and his father putting an arm around his shoulders. Then someone started clapping. It was an older woman, one of David's relatives I didn't know. Others joined in, a scattered applause that grew into something more substantial. Not everyone was clapping. Some people still looked uncomfortable or confused, but enough people were showing their support that the tension in the room began to ease slightly. David turned to his mother and pulled her into a tight hug. "I'm so sorry, Mom. You didn't deserve any of that. None of it. I should have seen who Melissa really was long before today." His mother was crying, but she held him tight. "I'm proud of you," she said, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "That took real courage. I know you loved her, or thought you did, and walking away from that in front of all these people takes real strength of character. Your father and I raised you right." I felt like I should leave, like I'd intruded on an incredibly private moment, but David turned to me before I could slip away. His eyes were red, and he looked exhausted, but there was also something like relief in his expression. "Rebecca," he said, walking over to me with his parents still close by. "Thank you for speaking up. Not many people would have done that. Most people would have stayed silent, would have told themselves it wasn't their business, would have let my mother be humiliated without saying a word. You didn't have to do that, especially at the risk of making yourself a target." I shrugged, feeling self-conscious with so many people still watching. I couldn't just stand there and let her say those things. I know too well what it feels like to be on the receiving end of that kind of cruelty. I've been that person who was told she was ruining photos, who was excluded from events because of how I looked, who was treated like an inconvenience just for existing. I couldn't watch someone else go through that without trying to do something. David nodded, fresh tears welling in his eyes. "I remember. You helped me so much in high school, not just with chemistry, but by being kind when a lot of other kids weren't. You probably don't know this, but I was dealing with some pretty severe bullying back then. Kids made fun of my accent, my glasses, the way I dressed. They called me all sorts of slurs. I was struggling with depression and actually thought about dropping out of school. But having at least one person who treated me like I mattered, who saw me as more than just the weird Asian kid, made a huge difference. You might have saved my life without even knowing it. I was genuinely surprised. I hadn't known David was being bullied. He'd always been so quiet in class. I'd assumed he was just shy and studious. I didn't know, I said. I'm sorry you were going through that. No one should have to deal with that kind of hatred. That's because you were dealing with your own stuff, he said. But I noticed how kind you were to everyone, even when you were going through hell yourself. That's real character. That's the kind of person I thought Melissa was, but clearly I was wrong. You're the kind of person I should have been looking for all along. His mother stepped forward then and took my hands in hers. Her hands were warm and soft, and she squeezed mine gently. Thank you, dear. What you did tonight means more to me than you could possibly know. I've dealt with comments about my weight my whole life, but having someone, especially someone who didn't even know me, stand up for me like that is something I'll never forget. You're an extraordinary person. I felt tears streaming down my own face now. You don't have to thank me. You deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. Everyone does. And what she said to you was cruel and unacceptable. David's father extended his hand to me, and I shook it. He had a firm grip and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. Thank you, young lady. My Linda here is the best person I know, and it broke my heart to see her treated that way. I'm glad someone had the backbone to call it out. The reception had slowly started to come back to life around us. The DJ, unsure what else to do after the dramatic turn of events, had started playing soft music again. Some guests were leaving, clearly uncomfortable with the drama and unsure whether they should stay or go. But many were staying, perhaps curious about what would happen next, or perhaps showing their support for David and his decision. David looked around at the venue, at the decorations and the food and the cake and all the remnants of what was supposed to be his perfect day. Then he smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time since I'd seen him that day. You know what? He said, his voice growing stronger. Mom and Dad paid a lot of money for this reception, and the food is already made, the bar is already open, and we've got a great DJ. I'm not going to let Melissa's cruelty ruin it completely. Let's turn this into a party celebrating good riddance to someone who didn't deserve to be part of our family. Let's celebrate honesty and integrity and standing up for what's right. His mother laughed through her tears, the sound relieved and joyful. I like that idea very much. David turned to address the remaining guests, many of whom were still standing around awkwardly, unsure what to do. He walked over to the DJ and took the microphone. I know that was extremely awkward for everyone, and I apologize for the drama. If anyone wants to leave, I completely understand, and there's no hard feelings. But for those who want to stay, I'd like to turn this into a different kind of party. Not a wedding reception, obviously, but a celebration of the fact that I just dodged a massive bullet and learned something important about integrity and standing up for people you love. The food is here, the drinks are here, the music is here. So please, eat, drink, dance, and help me celebrate making what might be the best decision of my life, even if it came at the worst possible time. There was a moment of uncertain silence, and then someone whooped from the back of the barn. It was David's uncle, the one who'd spoken up earlier. I'll drink to that, he shouted, raising his glass. Others laughed and raised their glasses as well. The mood shifted dramatically, the tension breaking like a storm cloud dissipating. People who had been tense and uncomfortable started to relax. The bar got busier as people lined up for drinks. The dance floor began to fill up again. There was this collective sense of relief, like everyone felt better knowing that David had stood up for his mother and that this wedding, which had been built on superficial values, wasn't going to happen after all. David turned to me again, still holding the microphone. And I want to especially thank Rebecca Morrison, my friend from high school, who had the courage to speak up when everyone else was silent. Rebecca, would you join me for the first dance of this very strange party? I laughed, wiping tears from my face. I'd be honored. The DJ put on a song, something upbeat and fun rather than a traditional romantic first dance song. David and I went out onto the dance floor, and his parents joined us, along with several other relatives and friends. Soon the floor was packed with people, all of us dancing and laughing and celebrating the fact that sometimes the right choice is the hardest one, but it's still the right choice. I spent most of the evening talking with David and his parents. His mother, Linda, was indeed one of the warmest people I'd ever met. We found a quiet table away from the dance floor and just talked for hours. She told me about her life, about growing up in Taiwan and immigrating to the United States with her family when she was 15. She talked about the culture shock, about learning English, about facing discrimination both for her race and, as she gained weight over the years, for her size. She'd been thin as a young woman, she told me, showing me pictures on her phone of her wedding day. In the photos, she was stunningly beautiful and indeed quite slim in a traditional white wedding dress. But after having David and his younger sister Emily, she'd gained weight that never quite came off. She talked about the pressure from her own family to lose weight, the Chinese cultural emphasis on appearance and face, the way her mother-in-law had made subtle and not so subtle comments about her size for years. I went through so many diets, she said. Every fad diet you can imagine. I took pills that made my heart race. I tried eating only cabbage soup for weeks. I joined weight loss groups where we'd weigh in publicly every week. Nothing worked long-term, and each failure made me feel worse about myself. Eventually, I gave up trying to please everyone else and decided to focus on being healthy and happy at whatever size I was. She talked about the discrimination she'd faced, how doctors dismissed her health concerns and blamed everything on her weight without actually addressing her symptoms, how strangers felt entitled to comment on what she was eating in restaurants, how clothing stores made her feel like she was asking for too much by wanting fashionable options in her size, how she'd overheard her own daughter, Emily, defending her to friends who'd made cruel comments about her appearance. The worst part, she said, her eyes glistening with tears, is feeling like you're an embarrassment to the people you love. I know David and Emily love me unconditionally, but I've always worried that I'm somehow less than what they deserve in a mother, because I don't look the way society says I should look. Tonight, when Melissa said those things, it confirmed my worst fears that I'm ruining important moments for my children just by being present in my body. I reached across and squeezed her hand, my own tears flowing freely. You are not an embarrassment. You are not ruining anything. Your worth has absolutely nothing to do with what you weigh or how you look. You raised an incredible son who had the courage to stand up for what's right, even when it cost him everything. That's a testament to who you are as a person and as a mother. She squeezed back, nodding through her tears. Thank you. You'll never know how much I needed to hear that tonight, especially from someone who understands. I shared my own story then, about weighing 347 pounds and hating myself so much I'd essentially stopped living, about Amanda's intervention and the years of hard work it took to lose the weight and get healthy, about the therapy and the emotional work of unpacking years of trauma and self-hatred, about how I still struggled sometimes with feeling like I didn't deserve good things, how I still heard the cruel comments from my past echoing in my head, how seeing someone else experience what I'd experienced had triggered something in me that I couldn't ignore. It's crazy how words can haunt you, I said. I can't even remember the names of half the people who were mean to me in high school and college and throughout my adult life, but I remember exactly what they said and how it made me feel. Those words carved themselves into my brain and my heart. Even now, after losing all the weight, after therapy, after building a new life, those words still have power over me sometimes. Linda nodded vigorously. Yes, exactly. People don't realize that casual cruelty isn't casual for the person on the receiving end. Those offhand comments, those jokes, those looks of disgust, they accumulate over years and years until you start to believe that's all you are. That your body is the only thing about you that matters. And since your body doesn't meet society's standards, you as a person are worthless. We sat there, two women from completely different backgrounds and life experiences, bonded by the shared trauma of living in bodies that society deemed unacceptable. We talked about the complicated relationship between self-worth and physical appearance, about how hard it is to separate your value as a person from your weight, when the world constantly tells you they're the same thing. We talked about the courage it takes just to exist in public spaces when you know people are judging you, about the energy it requires to hold your head high when part of you just wants to disappear. David's father, Robert, joined us at some point, pulling up a chair and listening quietly. He was a man of few words, but what he did say was thoughtful and kind. He told me he'd watched his wife struggle with weight discrimination for decades and felt helpless to protect her from it. He talked about his own anger at a society that reduced his brilliant, kind, accomplished wife to nothing more than a number on a scale. Linda is a retired nurse, he said with obvious pride. She worked in the pediatric ICU for 30 years, saving children's lives, comforting families during their worst moments. She volunteered at our church, organized community meals for homeless families, fostered 3 teenagers through the most difficult years of their lives. She learned to speak 4 languages so she could communicate with more of her patients and their families. But none of that matters to people who judge her based on her appearance. They see a fat woman and assume she's lazy, undisciplined, lacks self-control. They have no idea who she really is. I watched Linda's face as her husband spoke about her, saw the love and gratitude there, and felt hopeful that maybe there were good men in the world after all. Men who saw women as whole, complex human beings, rather than objects to be evaluated based on their aesthetic value. As the evening wore on, David and I found ourselves sitting at a table away from the crowd, catching up on 15 years of life since high school. The party was still going strong around us, people dancing and laughing, but we carved out our own little bubble of conversation. He told me about going to college for mechanical engineering at MIT, about how challenging but rewarding it had been, about working his way up in his career, starting as a junior engineer, and eventually becoming a project manager at a renewable energy company. He talked about the various relationships he'd had over the years, women he'd dated but never quite connected with in the way he'd hoped. Melissa seemed perfect at first, he admitted, swirling the wine in his glass. She was beautiful, obviously, but she was also smart and ambitious. She had a successful career in marketing, she was funny, she seemed adventurous. We traveled together, went to concerts and museums, had great conversations about books and politics and philosophy. But over time, I started to notice little things that bothered me. Like what? I asked. Like the way she talked about people who didn't meet her standards. Waiters who were too slow, co-workers who weren't polished enough, homeless people we'd pass on the street. She'd make these cutting comments, nothing overtly cruel but just dismissive, like those people weren't fully real to her. And she was obsessed with appearances, not just her own but everyone's. She'd spend hours getting ready for events, which is fine, but she'd also critique what other people were wearing, comment on their hair or makeup, judge them for not putting in enough effort. I told myself she was just detail-oriented, that it was part of her marketing background. But looking back, I think she was just shallow. He paused, looking down at his hands. My parents had reservations about her from the start. Mom tried to get to know her better, invited her to family dinners, asked about her work and her family, but Melissa always seemed cold to her. She'd come to dinners but spend most of the time on her phone. She'd give one-word answers to Mom's questions. She'd make excuses to leave early. Dad told me privately that he thought Melissa looked down on our family because we're not wealthy, because we live in a modest house in the suburbs instead of some fancy neighborhood. But I made excuses for her. I thought they just needed more time to understand each other. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. You wanted to believe the best about her. That's not a flaw. That's actually a really good quality. You saw the potential for good in her and hoped it would develop. Maybe, he said, but I should have listened to my gut. And I definitely should have listened to my parents. They know me better than anyone, and if they had concerns, I should have taken them seriously, instead of dismissing them as being overprotective or old-fashioned. We talked about my weight loss journey in more detail, and David asked thoughtful questions about both the physical and emotional aspects. He wanted to know what had finally motivated me to change, how Amanda had helped, what the hardest parts were, how I'd dealt with setbacks. He asked about the loose skin and how I'd come to terms with it, about the therapy and what I'd learned about myself, about how dating had changed or not changed after losing weight. Did people treat you differently after you lost the weight? He asked. I nodded. Absolutely. It was shocking, honestly, how differently people treated me. Strangers smiled at me more, held doors open, started conversations. At work, people actually listened when I spoke in meetings instead of talking over me. Men who'd never given me the time of day suddenly asked me out. It was validating in some ways, but also really painful because it confirmed that I'd been right all along. People had been treating me worse because of my weight. My personality hadn't changed, my intelligence hadn't changed, my sense of humor hadn't changed. Just my body. And suddenly I was worthy of basic human kindness and respect. That must have been hard to process, he said. It was. It still is sometimes. Because part of me is grateful for how much easier life is now, but another part of me is angry that it has to be this way. Why should my worth be tied to my appearance? Why should I have to change my body to be treated with basic dignity? And what about all the people who can't lose weight or who choose not to? Do they deserve to be treated like second-class citizens? David nodded slowly. No, they don't. Which is why what you did tonight was so important. You stood up and said that this isn't acceptable, that people deserve dignity regardless of what they look like. You reminded all of us, including me, that we have a responsibility to speak up when we see injustice, even when it's uncomfortable. We talked for hours, long after most of the guests had left. We talked about books we loved, movies that had impacted us, our jobs and whether they fulfilled us, our dreams for the future, the people we'd become since high school. There was an ease between us that surprised me, like we were picking up a friendship that had been put on pause 15 years ago and finding it still fit comfortably. David told me about his younger sister, Emily, who was currently teaching English in South Korea. He showed me pictures of her, a beautiful young woman with their mother's delicate features and bright, intelligent eyes. He talked about how close they were, how she'd called him just last week to express her own concerns about Melissa, how she'd said she couldn't picture Melissa as part of their family long term. "I wish I'd listened to her," he said. "Emily has great instincts about people." She told me Melissa seemed performative, like she was playing a role of what she thought a good girlfriend should be rather than actually being genuine. But I was in love, or thought I was, and I didn't want to hear it. "What do you think you were actually in love with?" I asked gently. He thought about this for a long moment. "I think I was in love with the idea of her. With the idea of being with someone beautiful and successful who chose me. I've struggled with insecurity my whole life, always felt like I wasn't quite enough, not American enough, not cool enough, not confident enough. Melissa made me feel like maybe I was finally worth something because someone like her wanted to be with me. But that's not real love. Real love is about seeing someone fully, flaws and strengths and everything in between, and choosing them anyway. Real love is about shared values and mutual respect and genuine affection. Melissa and I didn't have that. We had attraction and compatibility on a surface level, but we didn't have the deep stuff that matters." I understood what he meant. I'd dated guys after losing weight who were attracted to my appearance but had no interest in really knowing me as a person. They liked how I looked on their arm, liked being able to post pictures with me on social media, but they didn't care about my thoughts or feelings or dreams. Those relationships never lasted because there was nothing substantial holding them together. Finally, around midnight, the venue staff started cleaning up, and David walked me to my car. The vineyard was quiet now, just a few staff members breaking down tables and chairs inside the barn. The September night was cool and clear, stars visible overhead in a way they never were in the city. "Rebecca," he said as we reached my car, "I know this is probably the worst timing ever, given that I just called off my wedding and all, but would you want to get coffee sometime? I'd really like to keep in touch. Tonight reminded me of how much I valued your friendship back in high school, and I'd like to rebuild that if you're open to it." I smiled, warmth spreading through my chest. I'd like that a lot. We exchanged phone numbers, and as I drove home that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not just about potentially reconnecting with David romantically, though that was certainly on my mind and made my heart race in a way I hadn't experienced in years, but hope about the kind of person I'd become. I'd stood up for someone who needed defending, just like Amanda had stood up for me. I'd used my voice when it mattered, even though I was scared and my hands were shaking and part of me wanted to just stay quiet and invisible like I'd been for so many years. I'd been brave in a way that mattered, and that felt like a victory all its own. The next morning, I woke up to a text from David. "Thanks again for last night. Not just for standing up to Melissa, but for reminding me what real kindness looks like. Coffee next Saturday?" I texted back immediately. "Definitely. Looking forward to it." Amanda called me later that day and I told her everything that had happened. She was shocked, proud, and excited all at once. "Rebecca, this is huge," she said. "Not just the potential romance thing, though that's pretty amazing, but the fact that you stood up like that. Do you realize how far you've come?" "I do," I said, "and I couldn't have done it without you. You saved my life, Amanda. You gave me a chance to become who I was meant to be." She was quiet for a moment. "You did the hard work. I just helped you remember that you were worth fighting for." Over the next few weeks, David and I saw each other regularly. We went for coffee, then dinner, then hiking in the mountains. We talked about everything and nothing, shared our fears and dreams, and slowly started to build something real. He was still dealing with the aftermath of the canceled wedding, dealing with vendors and refunds and well-meaning but nosy relatives who wanted to know all the details. But through it all, he never wavered from his decision. He told me that night at the reception had been clarifying in a way nothing else had been, that it showed him exactly what kind of person Melissa was and what kind of life he would have had with her. I met with Linda several times as well. She and I formed a bond over our shared experiences, and she became like a second mother to me. She told me stories about David as a child, shared recipes and life advice, and always made me feel welcome and valued. One afternoon, about 2 months after the wedding that wasn't, Linda and I were having tea at her house when she brought up something that had been on her mind. "Rebecca," she said, "I need you to know how much it meant to me that you stood up for me that night. I've dealt with comments about my weight my whole life, but having someone, especially someone who didn't even know me, defend me, like that was incredibly powerful. You made me feel like I mattered." I felt tears welling up. "You do matter, Linda. Your worth has nothing to do with what you weigh or how you look. You're an amazing person, and anyone who can't see that is blind. She reached across and took my hand. I see now why my son cares about you so much. You have a beautiful heart. That evening, David took me to the same vineyard where the reception had been held. I was surprised when we pulled into the parking lot. "Why are we here?" I asked. He smiled mysteriously. "You'll see." We walked through the vineyard as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Finally, we reached a small gazebo overlooking the rows of grapevines. "Rebecca," he said, taking both my hands in his. "I know we've only been seeing each other for a couple of months, and I know I come with a lot of baggage from my failed almost marriage. But I need you to know that you've changed my life. Not just because you stood up for my mother, though that was incredible, but because you remind me every day what real character looks like." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "When I think about the kind of person I want to spend my life with, I think about someone who is kind even when it's hard, who stands up for people who can't stand up for themselves, who has fought real battles and come out stronger. I think about someone exactly like you." I felt my heart racing. "David," I started, but he gently squeezed my hands. "I'm not asking you to marry me," he said with a laugh. "It's way too soon for that, and I think we both know I need some time before I'm ready for that step again. But I am asking if you'll continue this journey with me, wherever it leads. I'm asking if you'll let me love you the way you deserve to be loved." I couldn't speak. All I could do was nod and pull him into a kiss. We stayed at the gazebo until the stars came out, talking about our future, our hopes and dreams, and what we wanted to build together. It felt right in a way nothing else ever had. The next year was one of the best of my life. David and I continued to grow closer, building a relationship based on mutual respect, understanding, and genuine affection. We traveled together, met each other's friends and families, and supported each other through life's ups and downs. I continued my health journey, not to lose more weight, but to maintain what I'd achieved and keep growing stronger mentally and physically. Amanda and I were closer than ever, and she was thrilled to see me so happy. Marcus, my trainer, became a good friend, and I even started volunteering at the gym to help other people who were struggling with their weight and fitness. Being able to use my experience to help others was incredibly fulfilling. David dealt with the aftermath of his broken engagement with Grace. Melissa had tried to contact him several times in the months following the canceled wedding, claiming she'd made a mistake and wanted another chance, but he'd been firm in his decision. He told me he felt like he'd dodged a bullet and was grateful that her true character had revealed itself before they were actually married. On the anniversary of that fateful wedding reception, David planned a surprise for me. He took me back to the vineyard, where the staff had set up a beautiful picnic dinner overlooking the grapevines. As we ate and watched the sunset, he told me about all the ways I'd changed his life. "A year ago, I thought I knew what I wanted," he said. "I thought I had everything figured out. But the truth is, I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life. If you hadn't had the courage to speak up that day, if you hadn't reminded me and everyone there what real character looks like, I might have gone through with that wedding. I might have spent years in a relationship with someone who didn't share my values, who would have eventually broken my heart in far worse ways." He pulled out a small box, and my heart skipped a beat. But when he opened it, instead of a ring, there was a beautiful necklace with a small pendant shaped like a phoenix. "I'm still not ready to propose," he said with a gentle smile. "I need a little more time to heal from everything that happened, but I wanted to give you this as a symbol of what you mean to me. You rose from the ashes of your old life and became this incredible, strong person. You inspire me every day to be better, to be kinder, to be braver. And when I am ready to take that next step, I hope you'll still be by my side." I put on the necklace, tears streaming down my face. "I'll be here," I said. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." We held each other as the sun disappeared below the horizon, and I thought about how far I'd come from that person who couldn't bear to leave her apartment, who hated herself so much she'd given up on life. I thought about Amanda's intervention, about Marcus's patience, about all the small steps that had led me to this moment. But most of all, I thought about that night at the wedding, about finding the courage to speak up when someone needed defending, about how one moment of bravery had opened up an entire new chapter of my life. I'd learned something crucial on this journey. It wasn't just about losing weight or getting healthy, though those things were important. It was about finding my voice, about standing up for what was right even when it was scary, about refusing to let people treat others as less than human. It was about transforming not just my body, but my entire sense of self-worth and purpose. 6 months later, David did propose, and this time there was a ring. We got married in a small, intimate ceremony surrounded by the people who mattered most. Linda stood beside me as we exchanged vows, tears streaming down her face, and Amanda was my maid of honor. In my vows, I thanked David for seeing me for who I truly was, for loving all of me, including the parts that still carried scars from the past. I promised to always stand up for what was right, to be brave even when it was hard, and to build a life with him based on kindness, respect, and genuine love. And I kept those promises. We built a life together that was full of love and laughter, challenges and growth. We supported each other's dreams and held each other through hard times. We made our home a place where people felt welcomed and valued, regardless of what they looked like or where they came from. Years later, I would look back on that wedding reception and marvel at how one moment had changed the trajectory of my entire life. If I hadn't found the courage to speak up, if I'd stayed silent like everyone else, I might never have reconnected with David. I might never have found the love and partnership I'd always dreamed of, but never thought I deserved. But more than that, I'd found myself. I'd discovered that I was brave, that I had a voice worth hearing, that I could make a difference, even in small ways. I'd learned that transformation isn't just about changing your body, it's about changing your entire relationship with yourself and the world around you. I continued volunteering at the gym, helping others find their own paths to health and self-acceptance. I shared my story whenever it might help someone else who was struggling. And I never forgot what it felt like to be on the receiving end of cruelty, which made me more determined than ever to stand up against it wherever I saw it. Amanda and I remained incredibly close. She often joked that she'd saved my life, and I'd repay her by giving her the most dramatic story to tell at parties. But underneath the humor, we both knew the truth. She had saved my life, and I would spend the rest of my days trying to live up to that gift by being the best version of myself I could be. David's relationship with his mother became even stronger after the canceled wedding. Linda told him repeatedly that while she'd never wished for him to go through that kind of public humiliation, she was grateful it had happened before he'd legally tied himself to someone so cruel. She adored me, and the feeling was entirely mutual. On difficult days, when I still struggled with negative thoughts about myself, or when I encountered people who were unkind, I would touch the phoenix necklace David had given me. It reminded me of who I'd become and what I'd overcome. It reminded me that I had the strength to rise above anything life threw at me. The last time I saw Melissa was about 3 years after the canceled wedding. I was out shopping with Amanda when we ran into her at a coffee shop. She looked older, harder somehow, and she was alone. When she saw me, recognition flickered in her eyes, followed quickly by anger. I expected her to say something cruel or to turn and walk away, but instead, she approached us. For a moment, we just looked at each other, years of complex history hanging between us. Finally, she said, "I heard you married David." I nodded. "We're very happy." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something I never expected. What I said that day was wrong. I was cruel and shallow, and I hurt people who didn't deserve it. I've had a lot of time to think about the kind of person I was, and I'm not proud of it. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tell her that her apology came too late, that the damage was done. But another part of me, the part that had learned about grace and forgiveness through my own journey, felt compassion for her. "Thank you for saying that," I said. "I hope you found some peace." She nodded, a sad smile on her face. "I'm working on it." Losing David was the wake-up call I needed to realize I needed to change. I'm in therapy now, dealing with a lot of issues I'd been avoiding. I can't take back what I did, but I can try to be better going forward. We parted ways after that brief conversation, and I found myself hoping she meant what she said. People could change. I was living proof of that. If she was genuinely trying to become a better person, then maybe something good had come out of that terrible night after all. As I walked away with Amanda, she squeezed my arm. "That was big of you," she said. "Not everyone would have been so gracious." I shrugged. I know what it's like to be at your lowest point and need someone to believe you can change. If she's genuinely trying, then I hope she succeeds. That night, I told David about the encounter. He was surprised that Melissa had apologized, but skeptical about whether she'd truly changed. Still, he agreed that everyone deserved a chance at redemption if they were willing to put in the work. I never saw Melissa again after that day, but I heard through mutual acquaintances that she'd moved to another city and was indeed in therapy, working on herself. I genuinely hoped she found happiness and became the kind of person who lifted others up instead of tearing them down. My own journey continued to evolve. I wrote a blog about my weight loss experience and my ongoing process of maintaining both physical and mental health. To my surprise, it resonated with thousands of people who were fighting their own battles. I received messages from people all over the world, thanking me for sharing my story and telling me how it had inspired them to keep going when they wanted to give up. I partnered with local schools to talk to teenagers about body image, bullying, and the importance of kindness. Every time I spoke to a group of young people, I saw myself in their faces, both the ones who were struggling and the ones who were doing the bullying without fully understanding the impact of their words. I told them my story, not to shame anyone, but to help them understand that every person has a story, that cruelty can have lasting impacts, and that choosing kindness costs nothing but can change everything. David and I eventually had 2 children, a daughter we named Sophie and a son we named Andrew. We raised them to understand that a person's worth has nothing to do with their appearance, that kindness is the most important character trait anyone can have, and that standing up for others, especially those who are vulnerable, is not just admirable, but necessary. Sophie, our oldest, had my auburn hair and David's kind eyes. When she was 8 years old, she came home from school one day in tears because some kids had been teasing a boy in her class about his weight. She'd stood up for him, and the other kids had turned on her. I held her while she cried, my heart breaking for her, but also swelling with pride. "You did the right thing," I told her. "It's not always easy to stand up for others, and sometimes it costs you something, but it's always worth it. That boy will never forget that you defended him when others were being cruel." She looked up at me with her tear-stained face. "Is that what you did, Mama? Is that how you met Daddy?" "In a way," I said. And I told her an age-appropriate version of the story, about how I'd stood up for his grandmother at a wedding, and how that one moment of courage had changed my entire life. From that day forward, Sophie became known at her school as someone who stood up for kids who were being bullied. She formed a kindness club that organized activities to promote inclusion and respect. Watching her use her voice to make the world a little bit better made every struggle I'd been through feel worthwhile. Andrew, our youngest, was quieter and more introspective. He loved books and art and preferred small groups to large crowds. When he was 10, he came to me with questions about why people were mean to each other, why they judged others based on appearances. We had a long talk about insecurity and fear, about how people often put others down to make themselves feel better, about how hurt people. But we also talked about breaking cycles, about choosing to be kind even when others aren't, about being brave enough to be different. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that night at the wedding and what it taught me. It wasn't just about standing up to a cruel bride or reconnecting with an old friend. It was about finding my voice after years of silence, about using my painful experiences to help others, about transforming hurt into purpose. Linda, my mother-in-law, lived to see both of our children grow up. She was an incredible grandmother, always making them feel loved and special. When she passed away at 78, peacefully in her sleep, the funeral was packed with people whose lives she'd touched. Person after person stood up to talk about her kindness, her generosity, her ability to make everyone feel valued and seen. During my eulogy, I talked about the night I'd met her, about how defending her had changed my life. I talked about the relationship we'd built over the years and how she'd become not just a mother-in-law, but a true mother to me. And I talked about the lesson she'd taught me simply by being herself, that every person has inherent worth and dignity that has nothing to do with their appearance or status or anything external. After the funeral, a young woman approached me. She was probably in her early 20s, and she was overweight, maybe 250 pounds. She looked nervous as she introduced herself. "My name is Emily," she said. "I've been following your blog for years. Your story helped me start my own journey to health. But more than that, it helped me understand that I'm valuable right now, not just after I lose weight." Reading about how you stood up for Mrs. Chen that night, about how you refused to let someone be treated as less than human because of their size, it made me realize I don't have to accept being treated poorly either. She paused, tears filling her eyes. "I just wanted to thank you, and to tell you that Mrs. Chen was lucky to have you in her life." I hugged her tightly, fighting back my own tears. "She was lucky to have me," I said. "I was the lucky one. She showed me what unconditional love and acceptance look like. And you, Emily, you're already valuable, right now. Exactly as you are. Don't ever let anyone tell you differently." That conversation stayed with me long after the funeral. It reminded me why sharing my story mattered, why standing up for others mattered, why every small act of courage and kindness created ripples that spread far beyond what we could see. Years turned into decades, and David and I built a life rich with meaning and purpose. We weren't perfect. We had our struggles and disagreements like any couple, but we always came back to the foundation of respect and kindness that had brought us together. On our 20th wedding anniversary, David took me back to the vineyard where everything had changed. We walked through the same paths we'd walked that night after his canceled wedding and the night he'd given me the phoenix necklace. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked him, standing up to Melissa that night, walking away from a wedding in front of all those people. He stopped walking and turned to face me, taking both my hands in his just like he had all those years ago. "Not for a single second," he said. "That night showed me who I was capable of being, who I wanted to be. It showed me that I could be brave, that I could stand up for what's right even when it cost me something. And it brought me to you, which was the greatest gift I could have received." He kissed my forehead gently. "You taught me that real love isn't about perfect appearances or perfect days. It's about choosing each other, standing up for each other, and building something real together. Every day I spend with you reminds me that I made the right choice." I looked out over the vineyard, remembering that first night, remembering how scared I'd been to speak up, how my hands had shaken as I'd confronted a stranger at her own wedding. I'd had no idea that moment would change everything, that it would lead to love and partnership and a life beyond my wildest dreams. But even if it hadn't led to any of that, even if I'd never seen David again after that night, speaking up would still have been the right thing to do, because some things matter more than comfort or convenience. Standing up for human dignity, refusing to let cruelty go unchallenged, using whatever privilege or platform you have to defend those who are vulnerable, these things matter. My journey taught me that transformation is possible, that people can change, that you can rise from the darkest places and build something beautiful. But it also taught me that transformation isn't just individual. When we stand up for others, when we refuse to accept cruelty as normal, when we use our voices to defend those who need defending, we create the possibility for collective transformation too. I spent years hating myself, believing I was worthless because of my weight. I let other people's cruelty define how I saw myself. But somewhere along the way, with Amanda's help and my own hard work and the support of people like Marcus and Linda and David, I found my way back to myself. I remembered that I had value, that I deserved love and respect, that I could be brave and strong and kind. And once I found that truth for myself, I couldn't stay silent when I saw others being treated the way I had been treated. I couldn't watch someone be humiliated and do nothing, because I knew exactly how that felt, and I knew that sometimes having just one person stand up for you can make all the difference. That's what I tell people now when they ask about my story. They want to know about the weight loss, about the dramatic wedding scene, about finding love with David, and those are all part of the story. But the real transformation wasn't about the pounds I lost or the relationship I gained. It was about finding my voice and learning to use it, about choosing courage over comfort, about believing that I and every other person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. We all have moments where we can choose to speak up or stay silent. We all have opportunities to stand with those who are vulnerable or to look away because it's easier. The choice we make in those moments defines who we are. I'm not special. I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who knows what it's like to hurt, to feel less than, to be judged unfairly. And because I know that pain, I can't ignore it when I see it inflicted on others. That wedding reception was 27 years ago now, but I remember it like it was yesterday. I remember the look on Linda's face when Melissa called her fat, the shock and hurt in her eyes. I remember my hands shaking as I walked toward the bride. I remember David's voice when he recognized me, the mixture of surprise and warmth. I remember standing there in front of all those people and thinking that this moment mattered, that I had to do something. And I'm so grateful I did. Not just because of what it brought into my life, though I'm endlessly thankful for David and our children and the beautiful life we've built together, but because in that moment, I became the person I'd always wanted to be. I became someone who stood up instead of staying silent, someone who used her pain to prevent others from hurting, someone who believed that kindness and courage matter. That's the real story. That's the transformation that changed everything. And it's a transformation that's available to all of us if we're willing to be brave enough to take it.